So good afternoon. I'm Andy Haun. I'm the Chief Technology Officer, as you said, for Schneider Electric's microgrid activities. And we're here this afternoon, to talk about data centers and the relationship of data centers to microgrids. And this is a key topic for us. As we know, we've had a number of problems related to energy systems in delivery of energy, electrical energy to our data center sites. And data centers have historically been forced by the electrical utilities to put a lot of extra heavy infrastructure in place to ensure the resilience of the critical activity that they're performing, which is an electro-intensive activity around securing the IT assets that they're either using for their own internal processes or if they're hosting sites to ensure their clients and or web services are available. And frankly, this has been a situation where resilience was such an overwhelming, important standard to achieve in a data center infrastructure that the cost was something that was weighed against the revenue stream of having clients lost or lost processing capability. And we didn't look so heavily at what the implication was on the energy delivery system, more on the energy resilience at the site. And you saw a lot of very important things evolving over the last 20 years with the Uptime Institute putting in characterization of data centers, different tier classes to ensure that data center resilience could be managed and monitored and even fairly evaluated. Now, a lot is changing in the energy side, and in case you haven't been awake over the last day and a half, we have a new energy landscape that's evolving. We have much of our infrastructure is seeing a disruption on the delivery side and the local prosumer arriving with low-cost energy coming on site. And even though we have critical operations to address in data centers, we have the opportunity to begin to also participate in some of this new, cleaner, renewable energy generation. And so in that regard, I would say over the last, it's been almost exactly the last 18 months, we've been embarking on a journey of conversation around data center and microgrid, or microgrid as data center. And the idea for us here is to continue this dialogue. So this session here today, we want it to be a dialogue, not just us giving a story, but to have you engage with us. So if you have questions, you have things you want to ask us along the way, or you just think we're lying to you, or you don't disagree with us completely, please, we want to hear those remarks because we want this to be something that's a continuation of a change in mindset around how data center power is provided and continuing to maintain the resilience while being green and more socially responsible at the data center level. So with that, I want to introduce Peter Asmus. Peter Asmus comes to us from Navigant, and he's been, particularly with me and with our microgrid organization, very active in this investigation around microgrids and data centers. So Peter, can you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what you've been doing?
Sure. Well, I have been, I just realized this year, I've been looking at energy markets for 30 years. And so the changes that have occurred over that time is pretty phenomenal. Before joining Navigant, I wrote several books. The first one was called In Search of Environmental Excellence back in 1990, which talked about business playing a role in environmental solutions. Then there was Reinventing Electric Utilities, which was the story of Sacramento, the only utility to close a nuclear reactor by a citizen vote, replacing it with solar, wind, energy efficiency, cogeneration. Then Reaping the Wind, the story of the wind power, and then another book with the exciting title of An Introduction to Energy in California, a University of California press book, just sort of about the history of energy, looking at California. But since about 2009, it was a company called Pike Research, which was the predecessor to Navigant Research, did my first report on microgrids. And back then, it was really hard to actually find information about microgrids. And since that time, obviously, the market has evolved. I did work with Schneider on a white paper sort of exploring this concept of data centers as microgrids. And I remember meeting with Andy at a data center conference and being at happy hour and saying, you know, people asking you, what do you do? And you say microgrids, and most of the people didn't know what a microgrid was. But since that time, I've been to a few more events, and I will say that definitely the interest is increasing. There's still a long ways to go, but we'll be talking about that today.
Great. Okay, so before we get into some of the details about what a microgrid for a data center might look like and what the implications are, we need to come back a little bit, and I apologize, but you kind of have to hear a little bit of the energy story. And why is this important today? First of all, we have a dramatic change happening in what we will call the renewable energy landscape. So while we have the new energy landscape, we also have a renewable energy introduction into that landscape. And it's driven largely by the fact that these renewable energy sources, these generation assets, are available today to be deployed locally close to the load. And what's important in a data center is an electro-intensive load. And if I can put some of these greener generation assets closer to the load, I reduce some of the energy losses in the transmission distribution systems, and I have more localized resiliency about generation around the things I'm trying to do locally with use of energy for data center operations. So wind energy is a very low-cost energy, has been for a good decade or so, and it continues to be better packaged and more easily deployed. But again, wind is an intermittent resource, so you have to do something, pair it with something that gives you a more consistent generation. PV is the same, and we've seen dramatic decreases in the solar PV costs. And with those dramatic decreases in the costs, we have the opportunity for companies who package these things nicely and make it easy for them to be deployed. So there's a relationship between renewable generation or greener generation that's using natural gas, such as a combined heat and power, or in the case of a data center, combined heat, power, and cooling plant, and or renewable generation that I can put close to the site. And while data centers have considered all along, how can I just buy greener energy and make that my means of operation, the fact that I can have it locally on site, taking away some of the energy consumption that I need, and maybe you can't site enough generation locally, but if you can do it to enhance your capability on your energy consumption on site, reduce your cost, and bring a more green environment for this particular industry, you're making a big step forward on how we make data centers look and appeal to the broader community. So the next thing to talk about before we go into data center too much is digitization. Now, data centers know about digitization, okay? For those of you in the data center space, you've been running data center infrastructure management. You've got lots and lots of sensors placed pervasively throughout your white spaces. The gray space or the power space has maybe been a little bit less digitized, but that's coming. It's coming from our solutions. It's coming from our competitors' solutions, who actually allow you to see and operate your power infrastructure in a digital manner. And it's not just about digital reporting. We talk too much about this. Yes, it's true. Pervasive sensing and information being brought up from all of these sensors, all of this information and metering and monitoring systems that we have in our data centers. But more importantly, when we bring this information up to a monitoring service and or a data aggregation site, it's about looking at the data, but making choices about what we do with that data and not having just reports made on data, which a report on data is in fact more data. So it's also about doing something with that data logically that'll allow you to act on that information. And our IoT structure, our EcoStruxure framework that drives our IoT for energy automation is doing both of these. It's bringing data up to an environment that we can process the data, but it's also sending down important pro forma information to control devices who can digitally control that energy. And in a microgrid space, or the microgrid for a data center or a distributed energy resource space, that means I can digitally control those assets. I can turn on and off inverters. I can turn on and off charging points for battery storage. I can turn on and off wind system output generation means. And with that digital control, I can optimize how I acquire energy from the grid, how I use local generation assets to turn energy on when the grid's a little bit dirty or expensive, and I can use green generation when I have it available and when my loads can allow it. And I can also even manage loads, all under digital control. And that's this important role of this digitization. And it's not just about data, it's about acting on the data in digital means. The next thing for us to discuss is this new arrival of decentralization. So the utility, and largely in the data center space, and for the large data centers, you are largely obligated to use the utility to bring power to your sites. The central system that we have today, which has served us well for 100 years and will continue to serve us well into the future, has been a unidirectional system. And this unidirectional system really focused it on giving us good, reliable power at the end use. It didn't mean it had good, resilient power, but it had good, reliable power. And let's say good at 99.9, or 3 nines, or 3+ nines of reliability. So you counted on it, and you used it, and data centers count on it and use it for a large portion of what they're doing. However, when it's not there, it's the action that gets taken when it goes away, and this is called resilience. And this is where data centers have been experts, because data center infrastructure is some of the most resilient infrastructure we have, where we have tier N+1 with maintenance capabilities, such in tier 3 data centers or tier 4 data centers with 2N or 2N+1. And we put this infrastructure in place to ensure that we have resilience in the case we don't have good access to the grid. And this is because of a unidirectional system. We don't manage that at the central system. We manage it at the edge, at the load, at the data center itself. Now, if we look to the future and we think, what's the future of the energy delivery system going to be? We have still the grid, the central generation, central distribution that helps us get energy to our sites. But also, we have the ability to put some local generation when we can site it, if it's available to site the generation, and we can use that generation to serve our own needs and/or use that generation to supplement needs in the grid. And this is the case where the prosumer, no longer just a consumer, but the prosumer is grabbing power from the grid, but also having the ability to contribute and/or use the grid for delivery back. And this action of the prosumer is what's causing grid operators to have to work more cleverly with smart grid and smart grid infrastructure, but allows you and us as prosumers the chance to actually reduce our total energy bill and the cost of the energy that we're paying, not only for the energy that we consume, but also helping others if we have energy generation assets that can contribute to the larger scale grid system. So decentralization with the prosumer is driving this generalized problem, and this is not going away. So Peter, if you can kind of talk to a little bit of the research that you've done, starting with how the centralized system is transforming.
Yeah, so to provide a little data backup to what Annie's been saying, here is a forecast that actually, when I first showed this, got a lot of emails, a lot of sort of shock from folks, showing that actually beginning this year, 2018, the amount of distributed generation, which in this case is defined as 1 megawatt and below, is actually more than the amount of centralized generation coming online. It's a little shocking, but if you look at the forecast, that gap grows over time. So by 2026, you're looking at something like 4 times as much of that distributed generation. Now that's fossil and renewable. A lot of it is solar. It's also other technologies. So I think this is just showing that the future is actually already here. It's already happening. And that's why folks are starting, including data centers, are starting to think about things a little bit differently. So here on the next slide, here's some data that was included in the white paper. It's still available. It's a white paper Navigant did for Schneider. And this is based on some IDC data. But what's the most interesting is not only the fact that there's a lot of capacity coming online, 7,000 megawatts in this year, but really it's more the trend if you look at internal data centers versus service provider data centers. You've been hearing a lot about energy as a service. We have some more slides on that a little bit later, but this is the trend, is that data centers are also shifting a little bit away from direct internal data center model. And why is this happening? There's a lot of reasons. I think part of the reason is just the average cost of an outage is climbing. You see here the one figure, this is some data from 2015, almost $250,000. That figure is actually a 38% increase compared to 2010. If you look at the maximum downtime, it's also increased 81% just between those years. If we extrapolate it out or looked at some more recent data, that number is probably holding steady, if not increasing. So there's also this idea of, if we're going to embrace new technologies and maybe the data center itself might not have that expertise, maybe it's good to sort of outsource some of that information. And what's interesting here is the top cause of data center power outages is the failure of some of the backup power systems. So that's where there are good backup power systems. I think if you think about Hurricane Sandy, what was interesting is that a lot of the backup power systems, in that case, they weren't data centers, failed because of lack of maintenance. So there's this issue of ongoing attention to all of these assets. So as the market becomes more complex, more diversity in the resources, there is this trend.
Peter, I would like to add to that point. When we talk about the very clever and important resilient infrastructures and systems that have been put in place in data centers, they're often built along the lines of having a well-known, established backup generation asset that's backing up against UPSs and other things that we do to ensure that the data center continues to operate. But we have systems in place and processes in place to do tests on those, to ensure that those are working, try to make sure that we have those operational assets in the case of an outage there to work with us. But the fact that they're not working all the time, because they're largely based on diesel generation backup, is that we can't run them, we can't permit them to run them all continuously, and the fact that they aren't running means we don't actually know all the time if they're going to be there and do exactly what we want to do. And this is one of the idea changes about using some localized generation assets that can act also, in addition to primary generation, be a part of your resiliency strategy in the data center backup. And it's an asset that if it's running all the time, you know its operating characteristics because it's actually there serving you continuously.
Right, and just to follow that up there, I end here with a question. Is there a better way to ensure uptime and resilience? And what we're arguing and sort of talk about in this white paper is maybe diversifying those on-site generation assets, network them with clean power infrastructure and things like, I have to say it, what's it called again? EcoStruxure?
EcoStruxure,
yeah.
Yes.
So here, I mean, the data center industry is greening itself. I'm not going to read all these statistics, but you can see a lot of commitment to renewable energy supply. Now, the sort of default way to do that is to buy renewable energy credits and keep basically your on-site assets essentially unchanged, but basically green up the supply. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. That's in some ways one of the easiest ways to do it, because there's lots of wind power. As most of you know, we probably talked about this, solar and wind are actually now some of the cheapest sources of energy. Back 30 years ago, that was definitely not the case. But you are starting to see some data centers sort of tiptoe into this market. Microsoft announced a program working with Primus Power using flow batteries, setting a goal of 50% renewable by 2018. Equinix, another company, going with Bloom Energy fuel cells. So you're starting to see a shift in this direction. We think that that trend will accelerate, but the key again will be digitization and control. So variable renewables sort of scare data centers. They not just data centers, but people like, how can I rely on that kind of technology? So really, a lot of the key will be in the ability to control basically those assets. And it's basically greater hybridization. So basically that's what's happening within data centers. They use the term hybridization also, but you can also look at it in terms of power supply, fossil and renewable and batteries all working together. And I think, well, here, one observation I made is I've also done a report on military microgrids, and I've even heard people say there's an emotional attachment to diesel generators within the military market, as well as the data center market. But as I mentioned, the other thing that's going on is there is a ramping down of emission limits on a lot of these technologies. So at some point, there will actually be a regulatory driver to say, if you want to use those assets other than an emergency, you can't. And so what we're sort of saying in terms of a microgrid, if you had cleaner assets, there wouldn't just be a cost involved with that, it could also be a revenue opportunity. One thing I did learn at a data center conference is when you use the term DR, which to someone like me stands for demand response, but in the data center market, that's, you would know,
recovery.
Disaster recovery, which is a bad thing. But, but there are revenue opportunities, and I think that's just where the future is having a cleaner mix of assets on site so that actually you can make money with those assets as opposed to them representing a cost that's sitting there just in the case of an emergency. And so that kind of boils down the basic message we're talking about. But with renewables, a lot of the data centers don't have that experience, and that's where this whole energy as a service, bringing in an outside solution provider is part of the equation. So I think that goes back to you.
Yeah, no problem. Just adding on to that, so here we are. We've kind of set the stage of what is the driver force behind this energy transformation. We know that data centers, there's a variety of different data centers, so any one of you or any one of us could be talking about a data center and actually have different ideas about it based on resiliency performance, based on whether it's an on-premise data center, a hosting data center, a cloud environment, maybe it's an edge data center. But all of these, what's really consistent in them is that data centers are requiring consistent and on-time, online power 24/7. And in this sense, whether we're putting energy on a building and there's a network closet data center or an edge data center, or we have a purpose-built data center and we're putting assets in place to ensure that we have this 24/7 power, the key for that is the power that we're relying on, if it's coming from the utility, is not going to be fully resilient, and the full resilience needs to come from edge-based resilience. And this is where the transition happens, where we talk about how do we put lower cost, physical lower cost from a capital standpoint and lower cost from a use standpoint on the edge power. And first off, if we have an expensive data center location, so call it the known places where energy costs can be high, places on islands, places in the Northeast, places in California, and or the Smile states where the energy prices can be relatively high, we have a chance to site some local generation that can just save you cost on the energy alone. And when you site it locally, you can use that in your formulation for your resiliency. So it's running, it's operational, it's a secondary asset tied to the utility. The utility then has its level of reliability and its resiliency plan, and you can then supplement that with local generation for lower cost and resiliency. So you help your environment by having a local generation asset. In addition to being able to do that, you also then, with local generation assets, can begin to use them for purposes of cost optimization against your tariff structure, wherever this might be. So for instance, if you have a peak demand charge that you're carrying, and while you're a data center and you have a fairly normalized load, it's not, everyone wants to say it's a very stable load, it's normal, I would say, rather than stable, but you know what the demand charge is going to be. You can begin to manage that demand charge down by adding assets that can help you bring those peaks down during higher level times of operation in your data center. You also have the chance to use, if you have tariffs that have time of use pricing, and begin to shift some of that by adding some assets that are such as energy storage assets on site. So you have peak demand, time of use price opportunities to save cost with those same assets that also can help you with your resiliency plan. Reliability, we say increased reliability. We're not increasing the reliability of the grid. What we're doing is increasing the reliability of the energy delivery at your location when we do this, because in fact, The grid can go away according to its expected performance, but you keep the reliability of the local energy generation asset as something you can use, and if it's inadequate to cover your complete sourcing needs as a generation locally put in place, you have your supplemental backup systems that you would engage normally anyway to tie those in as a system. Now I'm talking about something that's starting to sound a little complicated. I've got grid generation, I've got local generation, different types of local generation, I've got backup generation systems, and I've got UPSs in place, and how do I manage all of this? And now data centers, your primary mission is to do data processing, and the data center power infrastructure isn't your business, it's your means to achieve that. And so if I make more complexity by adding more energy on site that you have to manage, it starts to put you in an uncomfortable space. At Schneider, this is what we do. We put control systems and automation systems that allow you to be able to access those energy resources reliably so that your total energy can become more resilient and more reliable as it's delivered to your facility. Energy security, and this comes in a couple forms. If the electric grid goes away for a long time and you can't access the electricity for a long period, you have some diesels with 1 week or 2 weeks of diesel fuel on site, and you have to bring diesel fuel in. If you have a local generation asset, such as a PV site, or you have a wind asset available that you can continue to include in your energy delivery, and you supplement it with some natural gas, maybe for local generation, this mix of generation assets gives you an ability to use assets that are resilient based on the variety and the differentiation of those assets so that one asset doesn't become the limiting factor for how you continue to operate. And then fundamentally, the last one is data centers have historically had kind of identity problems in that we've worried about how this data center is adding value to society. Now we know we rely on it for all of the important business and important personal things that you do, but it also comes with a lot of entertainment-based environment, a lot of other kind of less interesting things, but they use a lot of energy to do that. And so if you can be more socially responsible about how you generate energy and how you use it on your data center, you can use that and shine the star and say, look, I'm not taking coal-fired plant energy and running it to run a gaming site or something else. I'm actually using local generation that's greener and more environmentally friendly to provide those socially interesting services.
Yeah, just one little quick follow-on there. I think what you were talking about, diversity, I think that's one of the key lessons. I mean, the larger grid performs better when there is more diversity, just because if one fuel goes up in price and you have all the old saying, eggs in one basket, you want to have diversity. And the same thing you could say is for on-site, provided that you have controls that can manage all that. And I think one of the basic messages at this conference is with digitization, that is now possible. And in fact, that's where you become more resilient, is you hedge your bets. It's true that in some remote sites, like I'm working also on a project in Alaska, where they're saying that diesel fuel shows up only twice a year. So if that barge can't get through the ice field to deliver that fuel, there's actually lives at stake. Now that's an extreme example, but there the utilities are voluntarily going to 80% renewable, 90%. There's no mandate. It just makes economic sense.
Yeah, and I think you highlighted an important point, and I'll reference back even to an earlier conversation. I think it was a comment made by Chris Crosby in one of the earlier sessions today. You know, not all data centers are the same, not all siting issues are the same challenge and have the same opportunities associated with them. So it's going to be very specific to what your location can or cannot do and what the locational needs are according to the pricing and the tariff information and the ability to site local generation assets. So this isn't like a broad spread, do all of this for everything. This is really look at, when you look at the new requirements for your data center power infrastructure, you look at what are available in these kinds of asset characteristics. So one of the key things we actually talk about is using data centers as assets, utilities like data centers as assets, because they're a consistent load. Okay, it doesn't mean it's constant, but it's consistent. And in that sense, data center operators with a consistent load can continue to arbitrage that load for cost. And this is an example of how our automated software in Microgrids, this is a screenshot from our software suite, from our EcoStruxure Microgrid Advisor software, that's taking a battery energy storage system on site, and it's charging that battery during low cost or low price tariffs, charges that battery up, and then during the middle of the day, we'll discharge that battery to ensure that we drive down and manage down our peak loads, and also discharge the battery during periods when the price of the energy is highest from your local utility. So if you have a time of use tariff infrastructure, a battery energy storage system is an asset that you can put in place. You can take advantage of this characteristic of control and saves you cost. It also helps the utility because tariff rates are going up, not because they have the opportunity to gouge you, it's because they actually have to pay more to get more energy in those periods. And this helps them avoid that by you avoiding having to pay extra cost in those high tariff points. So putting an extended battery energy storage on site can give you just a simple battery energy storage can give you an economic advantage. Likewise, it can be an asset that fits into the power mix in case you have an outage coming from your local utility. Tied to that, we have a new technology where we're doing it to fit the data center market, and we've put a UPS, and we've made our UPSs that have lithium-ion battery systems in them. And so instead of having traditional UPS with a lead-acid battery, and the lead-acid battery would have, let's say, several hundred deep cycle life cycles in it, and then you would kill the battery. If you tried to do some of this energy arbitrage or management of your energy portfolio using the battery of a UPS, you would kill that UPS battery in a very short time. Yep. The fact that we are now moving to more environmentally friendly and more interesting use case friendly battery systems in the category of lithium ion allows you to put different types of lithium ion, because it's not just one type of lithium ion, there's an array of batteries that you can choose from. But you can put these lithium ion batteries on the UPS, and now you can say, all right, Mr. UPS, I actually want you to go on battery. Well, hold it here. You usually only go on battery when you've lost the power on the input to the UPS. So why would you make this choice? You make this choice because it allows you to actually reduce your consumption during the time when perhaps the energy is highest from your utility. So this is a peak demand responsive UPS. We have controls in our UPS now that you can command that UPS to be a dispatchable asset and that dispatchable energy load, and take the load off of the utility, saving you energy cost when the cost of the energy is highest, or in the case where you have mixed in additional local generation assets and they're not available, such as intermittent generation from PV, and you don't want the loss of the PV to force you to have to go back up on the utility cost asset, you would then dispatch this UPS, and the UPS would pick it up until the PV came back online again. So this is an important tool for a mixture of managing all of the energy you have in your data center infrastructure or data center power infrastructure. It's an adder, and it can replace directly a current UPS. And by the way, your UPSs, you're testing them anyway. You're testing the battery systems on your UPSs. This is an ongoing test of the battery system of the UPS. It's an internal, ongoing, online monitor of the UPS, in addition to giving you extended value for that asset that you purchased to ensure resilience of your site. Okay, Peter, talk to us a little bit about some new models of microgrid and how you finance microgrids.
Sure, and before I do that, I just wanted to comment about the battery. So one thing I will say, another trend since we started looking at microgrids in 2009 to now, is that it used to be people were designing microgrids to avoid energy storage because they were sort of the most expensive component, and so it was often, how do you make the battery as small as possible? Whereas now, I don't have the data, but I'd say probably at least 75%, if not more, of new microgrids have at least one form of battery, and some actually have multiple forms of battery. So we're also seeing hybridization with even the concept of energy storage. But here is some data. We have a product called the Microgrid Deployment Tracker. It's the only global data set of microgrids that anyone is, I always say, brave enough to publish, because it's very hard to get data on microgrids, especially more in developing world nations. And now, as it becomes more commercial, people have NDAs in place, and so it's like pulling teeth to try to get a lot of this data. But we've started to also track business models. We generally focus more on the DERs, and we do a lot of analysis of that. But here is, this has not been published yet. It's going to come out, I'd say, within the next few weeks. And you notice that energy as a service is #1. Just compared to our last report, it moved up a little bit. You see some of the other business models. Now, I'll have to say energy as a service would include things like the Schneider microgrids as a service. PPAs are included in that, as well as pay-as-you-go, pay-as-you-grow business models in the developing world, which is an energy as a service. Those people at the bottom of the pyramid do not have CapEx to spend on a microgrid, so they're basically incrementally paying off that microgrid over time. I think the biggest surprise here is utility rate base, but I have to point out that a lot of the microgrids for off-grid systems, little small island nations, we're working on a project right now with the World Bank looking at those kind of microgrids. A lot of those are utilities, but they're cash-poor utilities, but they are put in the rate base. But in that case, they are still looking for solution providers to come in. Owner financing, that's sort of, a lot of those are campus university systems, although we see them shifting a little more to the energy service as those microgrids become more complex. A lot of those microgrids start out as basically CHP systems that could island. Now often they're adding solar. When they're adding solar, they're adding batteries. It's becoming more complex. And then we have government funded. That's where government's the primary funder. A lot of microgrids have some form of government support. We just did a report also looking at those programs, on government programs, ranking them. And then we have the last category, which is sort of other. So this shows you, and we did a market forecast, and we are projecting that energy as a service will be the most popular business model for microgrids.
So why is energy as a service important? The key for us is that data centers exist in all of these spaces. So we have government data centers, you have private data centers, on-premise data centers, you have data centers that are purpose-built investment data centers. So all these different types of data centers have an objective of providing a data center function. The energy has always been a cost. And now what we're seeing is, with the idea of a microgrid, not just energy because the utility was your means of delivering that. Now with a microgrid, it's actually an asset, a generation asset and an energy asset that investors are interested in participating with. So the data center becomes a load, it becomes an interesting load, not just for a utility, but somebody who wants to go grab that load and say, I want to use that load to put in my energy systems. I connect my energy system to the utility, and I can monetize that energy system to you, Mr. Data Center Operator, and then you don't have to finance it, you don't have to own it, you don't have to manage it. You just pay us for the energy outcome from this energy system. And so the microgrid added on to a data center, because the data center being a very special electro-intensive load, is quite interesting for finance partners when you put the microgrid on that data center infrastructure. To that end, you've maybe been a part of a couple of our sessions, and we've had on stage Dynamic Energy Networks. Dynamic Energy Networks backed by the Carlyle Group. And this is fundamentally their interested role, and they're not the only ones doing this. We have other investment partners that we work with, but a number of them that you could access to, where you're really solving this problem of resilience, cost, lower cost energy, taking sustainable assets and integrate them into the mix, and then building out a data center power system portfolio, especially if you're in a data center-centric area where there are a number of data centers and investors want to go in and own these power system assets. And so frankly, if you are a data center co-locator or hosting, and you build a relationship with an investment partner, that investment partner will work with you to grow that space from an energy as a service. Also, if you're putting a data center in where these investment partners already exist, they'll be interested in participating because they already know the environment, they already know how the microgrid will function in that space. So you have opportunities to actually help yourself from both a CapEx, so you can avoid CapEx, and you help yourself from an OpEx because you can get lower cost energy out of the delivery of this locally produced assets. So with that, we say basically we have technology that allows you to integrate into the data center infrastructure, which you've all got very mature data center infrastructure strategies already. We can expand that data center infrastructure strategy with good technology, known technology, automation technology to use these assets, so it's no longer a big technical hurdle to add them. The financial piece has to make sense from a cost standpoint and the siting location perspective. But also, you have financing partners who are interested in owning and operating these assets, making it a financially easier thing to engage in. So, lower cost financing, easy technology, microgrids fit for very interesting critical power, electro-intensive applications, and data center sits at the top of that list. And that's why many utilities and/or investor-owned utilities that have investment arms of utilities continue to think about how do they expand their own space in the engagement of the microgrid for a data center because they are important clients for the utilities themselves. So with that, I think we're to the end of the post-presentation. We'd like to open it up. If anybody has any questions or comments that they'd like to raise, they can do so. I can't see very well here in the room.
No. I guess they can just come up to the microphone?
Yeah, please
Yep.
come up to the microphone and challenge us if it's, I'm ready for the challenge if nothing else.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Jim Hoyt. I'm with Harold Wells Associates, and we're advanced solution partners with the Schneider team in Northern California. And we are certainly excited about this possibility. As with our UPS systems that are now utilizing lithium-ion batteries, it's just an unbelievable change in our reliability that we supply to customers for critical products like UPS and also for energy storage. What I guess I'm concerned about as we look towards the future is how is this battery fulfillment going to occur with these products? I mean, we're using lithium-ion for cars and for all kinds of applications. And so is there an infrastructure that you're seeing in your review of suppliers to us that is going to be able to keep up with this exciting technology?
Yeah, that's a good question, and there's a lot of worry about that. Are we going to run out of shortage on lithium? Are we going to run? And lithium is like the 40th most available element. It's just hard to get it, so it's not in a lot of dense locations, so it's hard to actually access that. But it's not a rare element, okay? But so lithium is available, and they continue to advance on where to find and acquire lithium. Some of the other more expensive elements that could be a problem, such as cobalt, these are source elements that go into some of our higher energy density cells in the lithium category. And so there's some cost challenges on how they can continue to drive those costs down, okay? So that's going to be an ongoing issue. But there's the beauty of this is it's such a transformative activity for battery energy storage in solving many of our energy problems, not just those which would be appropriate for data centers, but for mobility and for stationary storage and grid services. There's lots and lots of new and differing kinds of technologies, even outside the lithium category of battery systems, but also not just going back to lead acid where you have limited life and cycle life, but with very long operating cycle life. And so really the battery energy storage and the demand is the availability is really outstripping demand. And that's really where we're at right now. Part of the reason we're having low-cost battery systems, just to be frank, is because the expectation on the uptick of the electric vehicle market didn't go as fast as everybody predicted, and there were huge investments by a lot of battery manufacturers to actually make infrastructure available to produce batteries. Now today, the demand has come and has followed, so we kind of stepped back and held back on the investment, and now the mobility demand has come on site, the stationary storage demand is picking up, and so now lead times are running out, but it's not because of really raw material limitations, it's really got to do with manufacturing scale up following right now, and there are some long lead times in the queue today for batteries, but if you foresee them, it's not like it's 3 years, it's usually 20-ish, 24 week kind of expectation on the demand. So, but really the ability to follow the demand, there's no indications that there's a problem there, and there's really no technology limitation that's going to be a problem.
Hi.
Yes?
I'm Suresh Pichai, Equinix. I was going to give a comment. First of all,
Sure.
Great presentation, thank you. But I'm going to cut out the comment because the time is up.
Yeah.
But I just want your opinion on going with natural gas as the primary grid and using fuel cells such as Bloom and solid power, et cetera.
Sure. So your question, or you're wanting to know really what's the interpretation of that from a green standpoint, or?
Well, you know, what we've been looking at is that there is a lot of reliability and storage built into natural gas.
Sure.
Grid system in the U.S. and in EMEA, in some of the locations, and some of the other locations in Asia, and there is cost differential. So it's okay, I'm not going to get into commenting, but just want to see if you validate what we've been thinking or you're diverging.
Yeah, so natural gas is a complicated worldwide conversation because it's not equitable everywhere. Okay, we can get and acquire and have infrastructure in place for natural gas in much of North America to solve for many of the locations where even electricity is difficult. Natural gas is an accessible and available resource to be able to use. It's not so available in the rest of the world, and we kind of have a luxury here. But in that case where it's not as available, other kinds of resources have to be considered because you're not going to have that, I would call it, infrastructure in place to be able to carry you through natural disasters. Now keep in mind, natural gas isn't disaster-free, okay? There are situations, earthquakes and other things where you actually have to shut the system down and manage and maintain that. And so you have to consider that in your mix of energy assets, not as the single asset, but as a part of an asset that brings energy to your site. If you try to rely on just natural gas, you're back to the same problem. You're relying on just an electricity system. So the diversity doesn't help you very much.
Yeah, I would just add there that it's true that I was just on a panel with Bloom Energy, and they were arguing that, yeah, natural gas is a good choice, or their technology was a good choice. But you mentioned, like in California, one of the challenges, earthquake threat. So there was a study in San Francisco that said if there was the same earthquake in 1906, which was a drastic earthquake, it would take maybe 5 days to bring back electricity, 4 days. It would take 3 weeks for natural gas to come online. But that's, again, it's a regional concern. So as to Andy's point, it's really about what is available locally, what are the threats right there. In Connecticut, the first state to pass a microgrid law in 2011, they viewed natural gas as part of resiliency because they had issues with diesel. So I think one thing we're seeing with generators is dual fuel generators. Generators able to burn diesel, natural gas, perhaps biomass even. That's a little more complicated. But I think you'll see a trend in the future about just thinking about resiliency, and again, this whole idea of diverse options. And so I think there is a role for natural gas. Diesels have, I think, a better black start. There are advantages to diesel, so we don't want to be
totally... it's not a replacement of diesel.
Yeah.
We're not telling you to run off and get rid of your diesel gens.
Right.
Okay?
But, so again, a blend or having both in a microgrid, which is often the case in North America. You might have diesel, natural gas, solar, battery, who knows, hydrogen. There's even, there are microgrids now. So that's the beauty of the microgrid, is that it is such a flexible sort of platform just to, well, there was Faith Technologies.
Yeah.
There's a great example of, they had a little hydrogen.
Yeah, we had
element.
hydrogen on microgrid. The context of the microgrid is that you can put in diverse assets. And the more diverse assets you put in, the more resiliency you get out of those assets, because you're not relying on one type of asset and the limitations of that single type of asset. And we had one example earlier in the panel, our presentation we did from Faith Technology, where they actually had 5 types of generation: PV, the grid, natural gas generation, had a diesel generation, a fuel cell, and electrolyzer for the fuel cell for the hydrogen on this hydrogen fuel cell. So there's a lot of very, very interesting technologies that you can put into an asset mix, including energy storage and different types of energy storage, both at the UPS level or a stationary storage at the site, that a microgrid facilitates the management of, which is why it's available today and why it's interesting to talk about it today versus what you would have done 15 years in your data center, because we didn't have the variety of the assets available to us as packaged dispatchable systems, and we didn't have the controls that allowed that to be managed efficiently and effectively. All of that is here from a technology standpoint today, and we have energy as a service to finance that for you today. So we've solved the technology questions, we've solved the financing question, so it should be something that should start in your conversations and then decide whether or not it fits, but should begin in the conversations that you're having about your data center power infrastructure.
And don't forget, EcoStruxure.
EcoStruxure is your answer to making that technology
It's
easy.
the answer to everything.
Yes. So with that, we know we're running to the end of the day here, and they're telling us to get off the stage. So thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it, and thank you to Peter for coming here and telling us about this.